The bar smelled like spilled beer, old wood, and the particular kind of pride that only exists in places where military men come to forget what they've seen. Salty's Bar and Grill sat 3 blocks from the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado, California, a Friday night institution for off-duty sailors, retired operators, local contractors, and the occasional civilian who wandered in without fully understanding what kind of room they were walking into. The walls were covered in unit patches, black and white photographs, and a handwritten sign above the register that read, "Respect is earned here. So is everything else." It was past 9 o'clock when Commander Rachel Hargrove walked in. She didn't make an entrance. That was the first thing people would remember later when they tried to piece together the night that she had simply appeared, the way fog does, without announcement or drama. She was 36 years old, medium height, lean in the way that distance runners are lean, with dark eyes that moved across a room the way a chess player moves across a board. Quiet, deliberate, always 2 steps ahead of what anyone else was seeing. She wore jeans, a faded navy sweatshirt, the lettering cracked at the edges, worn-down boots that had walked on sand in countries she was never allowed to name. No jewelry, no makeup. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, the kind that said, "I didn't do this for you." She sat at the far end of the bar, left corner, back to the wall, the seat that every veteran instinctively gravitates toward, the seat with sightlines to every door. Torres, the bartender, a stocky former Navy corpsman with a salt and pepper beard and the unhurried manner of a man who had seen everything twice, set a glass of whiskey in front of her without being asked. Not because he knew her name, because he knew the look. She nodded once, he moved away without a word, that was enough. For 40 minutes she sat alone. She didn't check her phone. She didn't look around for conversation. She sipped her drink with the patience of someone who had once waited 19 hours in a collapsed building in Fallujah without making a sound. 40 minutes in a California bar was nothing. It was almost pleasant. Then the door opened and the night changed. Donovan Cray came in the way certain men always do, louder than necessary, wider than the doorway required, trailing 4 associates who matched his energy the way lesser planets orbit a loud, ugly sun. He was 42, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a cinder block and eyes that were always scanning for something to diminish. He wore a black tactical shirt, the kind that contractors favored, the kind that screamed, "I used to be someone important," and carried himself with the specific arrogance of a man who had once had real authority and deeply resented losing it. Cray had done 8 years in the Army Rangers, then a private security contract in Iraq, then another in Syria. Somewhere along the way, the discipline had curdled into something else, a need to be the biggest thing in every room, a hunger to remind everyone around him of a status that no longer officially existed. He took over the center of the bar without asking. His crew scattered across stools and standing space, filling the room with their volume. The conversations around them didn't stop, they just got quieter, more careful. The kind of quiet that happens when a room collectively decides it doesn't want trouble tonight. Rachel didn't look up. She was on her second whiskey. She turned the glass slowly in her hands, studying the amber liquid the way a person studies something they've earned the right to understand. Around her, the evening shifted and reformed like weather. Cray's crew got louder. A song on the jukebox got turned up. Someone knocked over a bottle and laughed about it. One of Cray's men, a slab-faced contractor named Briggs, shoulder-checked a young seaman walking to the bathroom and didn't apologize. Still, Rachel said nothing. It was only when Cray planted himself directly beside her, crowding into her space with the body language of a man who had never been told no by anyone he respected, that she quietly set down her glass and said, without looking at him, "You might want to move down a few seats." Cray looked at her. He looked at her the way men like him always look at women who speak without being spoken to, with a slow, theatrical disbelief, the face of someone pretending to be surprised by the audacity of a small animal. "Excuse me," he said. "You and your group," Rachel said, her voice flat and even like a level pressed against a wall. "You're loud. You're pushing people around. Take it down or take it somewhere else." The bar did not go quiet, but it went careful. Cray looked at his crew. One of them, Walsh, a former Marine turned mercenary, grinned. Another started to laugh. Cray turned back to Rachel with the expression of a man who had made a decision. "Lady," he said, "do you know where you are?" "A bar," she said, "where people come to drink in peace." "This is a military bar," Cray said. "You got no idea who I am, do you?" She finally looked at him. Her eyes were very still. "I don't," she said, "and I don't need to." Something flickered in Cray's face then, something that, in a different man, might have been caution. But Donovan Cray had not survived this long by listening to the cautious parts of himself. He reached out and knocked her whiskey glass off the bar with the back of his hand. It shattered on the floor. Then he slapped her, open-handed, across the left cheek, not hard enough to knock her from her seat, but hard enough to be unmistakable, hard enough to be a statement. The crack of it cut through the music and the noise and the conversation, and suddenly the entire bar was looking. Nobody moved. Cray leaned in close, his voice low now, almost intimate. "Go home," he said, "before this gets worse." Commander Rachel Hargrove did not put her hand to her cheek. She did not make a sound. She did not look away from him. She set both hands flat on the bar, palms down, and for 3 full seconds she simply breathed, slow, measured, the breath of someone calibrating, not recovering. Tours behind the bar had gone very still. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He had seen men in the moments before terrible things happened. He recognized what was in Rachel Hargrove's eyes, and very quietly, without drawing attention to himself, he reached under the bar and turned off the jukebox. The room went silent. And into that silence, Commander Rachel Hargrove slowly stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't say a single word. She simply stood, and something in the geometry of the room changed. The way the air changes before lightning, when the electricity is already everywhere and the thunder is still 3 seconds behind. Cray was still smiling. He would not be smiling for long. Nobody in Salty's bar that night would fully agree on what they saw next. That was the thing they all kept saying afterward, in the parking lot, on the phone to their spouses, at the debrief that tours quietly held the next morning with the regulars who'd witnessed it. Not because the events were unclear, but because the speed of it made memory unreliable. The human brain, when confronted with something it has no category for, tends to fill in the gaps with the closest available comparison. And nobody in that bar had a comparison for what Commander Rachel Hargrove did in the next 40 seconds. Cray had 2 men flanking him. Walsh on his left, former Marine, 220 pounds, hands like sledgehammers. Briggs on his right, ex-Army, combat deployment in 3 countries, a man who had broken other men for sport and money. They weren't standing particularly close to Cray. They didn't think they needed to be. They were wrong. Rachel moved left first. There was no wind-up, no visible shift of weight. One moment she was standing with her hands flat on the bar, and the next she had closed the distance to Walsh before he had processed the decision to react. She caught his outstretched arm mid-reach, turned her body into his momentum with a precision that defied his size advantage, and Walsh, 220 pounds, a former Marine, went down against the bar stool with a controlled crash that left him folded and gasping, his arm pinned at an angle that made continuing to fight a decision between pride and permanent injury. Walsh chose correctly. He stayed down. Briggs came around fast, which was the right instinct, executed at the wrong speed. Rachel had already pivoted. She deflected his grab with her left forearm, not a block, something more fluid, almost courteous, the kind of movement that said, "I've done this 1,000 times," and redirected his momentum forward while her right hand found the precise point at the back of his neck that every close-quarters combat instructor calls the off switch. Briggs hit the bar floor face first and did not get back up. He was not unconscious. He simply had nothing left to argue with. 4 seconds. 2 men. Neither of them had landed a single touch on her. The bar was not breathing. Cray stared. For the first time in many years, Donovan Cray felt something he had trained himself to stop feeling. He felt afraid. But fear in men like Cray often burns through the filter of ego before it reaches the brain, and what came out the other side was fury. He lunged. He was bigger than her by 70 pounds, and he had trained and he had fought. And in a different story against a different person, he might have ended things with that lunge. But Rachel Hargrove had been assessed, trained, tested, and deployed in conditions that would have ended most careers and many lives, and she did not lunge back. She stepped aside. She caught his forward arm. She used his weight and his speed, both of which worked in her favor, not his, and guided him directly into the bar top with a controlled, deliberate force that pinned him there, face against the wood, one hand behind his back, immobilized with a grip that he could not break, and that she applied with a pressure so precise it was closer to engineering than violence. She wasn't even breathing hard. "Stay down," she said. Her voice was exactly the same as when she had asked him to move his seat. Flat, even, like a level pressed against a wall. Cray snarled something she didn't bother to listen to. The bar remained perfectly still. 22 people, veterans, sailors, contractors, bartenders, watched a woman in a cracked navy sweatshirt hold a 240-pound former ranger against a bar top with one hand while she reached across with her free hand, picked up the nearest intact glass, and poured herself a measure of whiskey from the bottle Cray's crew had left sitting on the bar. She took a sip. Someone in the back of the room exhaled audibly. It was the most human sound anyone had made in 40 seconds. Torres behind the bar was watching her with an expression that his wife would later describe when he tried badly to explain the evening as something between awe and recognition. He had served with men who moved like that. He had never seen a woman who moved like that, not in person, not like this. But the face he recognized. He had seen that face in commanders who had walked back into a firefight to retrieve the wounded. He had seen it in the ones who arrived at the worst moments and made them better by existing. He reached under the bar for his phone and then stopped. He looked at the 2 men on the floor, then at Cray pinned to the bar top, then at the woman calmly drinking her whiskey, and he made a decision. "Someone else call 911, he said. "I'm going to stay right here." He folded his arms and leaned against the back counter, and he watched. Cray's remaining 2 crew members positioned near the door, both of whom had made the intelligent calculation to stay exactly where they were not doing much better emotionally. One of them, a younger man named Pelletier, had his phone halfway out of his pocket and then slowly, carefully put it back. He had run the math and the math was bad. "Do you have any idea," Cray said, through his flattened cheek against the bar top, his voice tight with humiliation and rage, "who I work for?" Rachel set her glass down. "No," she said. "You're going to find out," Cray spat. "You have no idea what you just walked into, lady. No idea." "Okay," Rachel said. She held him for another few seconds until the sound of sirens came distantly from outside, then released him. She stepped back. She straightened the sleeve of her sweatshirt. She picked up her glass and walked back to her corner seat, the left end of the bar, back to the wall, sightlines to every door. Walsh was sitting up slowly. Briggs was still lying flat, apparently reconsidering several life choices. Cray pushed himself off the bar top, breathing hard, his face red and his eyes burning with a particular kind of hatred that belongs exclusively to men who have been made to feel small. He pointed at her from across the bar. "This isn't over," he said. She looked at him over the rim of her glass. "It is for tonight," she said. Two patrol cars arrived 4 minutes later. By the time officers Reyes and Delgado walked through the door, the scene they encountered was three men in various states of horizontal, one man standing and pointing at the bar with great agitation, 22 witnesses in a state of extremely focused silence, and a woman in a corner seat finishing her second whiskey with the serene composure of someone waiting for a bus. Officer Reyes looked at Torres. Torres spread his hands. "She was defending herself," he said, simply, clearly, "the way you state a fact that has no argument." Rachel set down her glass and reached into her back pocket. She produced a military ID and a small card. She placed both on the bar and slid them toward Officer Delgado without being asked. Delgado looked at the ID, then at the card, then at the ID again, then at Rachel. "Commander," he said carefully, are you hurt?" She touched her cheek briefly. There was the faint red print of a palm on her face. She had already forgotten about it. "No," she said, "I'm fine." Delgado looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at the card. The card had a number on it and a 4-letter designation that both officers recognized from a department briefing 6 months earlier. They had been told, in that briefing, that if they ever encountered this designation in the field, they were to stop what they were doing and call the number before proceeding with anything. Reyes stepped outside to make the call. He came back 3 minutes later. He walked directly to Delgado and said something quietly. Delgado blinked. Then he walked to where Cray was standing, agitated and vocal, and politely but firmly began explaining that he was going to need to come with them. "What about her?" Cray demanded, pointing. "She assaulted 3 of my men." "Sir," Delgado said, in the tone of a man who has just been told something that has reorganized his understanding of the evening, "I'm going to need you to come with us now." Cray looked across the bar at Rachel one final time. She raised her glass slightly, not a toast, just an acknowledgement. He left in handcuffs. Torres waited until the last patrol car had pulled away. Then he walked to the far end of the bar, picked up the bottle of whiskey, and refilled Rachel's glass without a word. She accepted it without a word. They sat in that understanding for a moment, the comfortable, wordless communication of two people who have been in serious situations and know how to exist in the quiet afterward. "Hell of a Friday night," Torres finally said. Rachel looked at the glass. Something that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face. "I've had worse," she said. Torres nodded. He believed her completely. Detective Marcus Acaffer had been with the San Diego Police Department for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he had encountered 4 types of people that the system didn't know what to do with. The first were the dangerously mentally ill, for whom every interaction required a separate protocol and a separate kind of patience. The second were the politically connected, city council members' cousins, judges' golf partners, the kind of people who made a single phone call and rearranged the furniture. The third were the genuinely innocent, caught in situations so unlikely that the paperwork alone became a kind of institutional bewilderment. The fourth were federal. He had never, in 11 years, encountered all 4 categories simultaneously, until the woman in the faded navy sweatshirt sat down across from him at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night in interview room 2, and looked at him with the composed patience of someone who had sat in worse rooms for longer. Acaffer ran her ID through the standard database at 11:53 p.m. At 11:54 p.m. his screen went gray. Not a crash, not a technical error. The system simply returned a response he had seen only once before in his career, a gray field with a single line of text. "Restricted access, SOCOM level IV clearance required, contact NCA duty officer immediately." He stared at it. Then he picked up his desk phone and called the duty officer number printed on the card she had given Delgado at the bar. The phone rang once. A man answered. His voice was unhurried and precise, the voice of someone who was completely awake at midnight because being completely awake at midnight was part of the job description. "This is Major Whitfield. Who am I speaking with?" "Detective Ockefer, San Diego PD," Ockefer said. "I have a—" "Commander Hargrove," Whitfield said. "Yes, I know. I've been waiting for your call." Ockefer looked through the one-way glass at Rachel, who was sitting in interview room 2 with her hands folded on the table, apparently contemplating nothing in particular. "What exactly is going on here, Major?" "Detective, I need you to listen to me carefully," Whitfield said. "Whatever occurred tonight, Commander Hargrove was not the aggressor. If the incident reports from responding officers bear this out, and I believe they will, I'm going to need you to process her witness statement, document any injuries she has sustained, and release her." A pause. "Without charge, without hold, and without logging her military ID details into any network database." Ockefer looked at his gray screen. "That last part already took care of itself," he said. "Yes," said Whitfield, "it tends to." "And the men who were detained with her?" "That," Whitfield said, "is a separate matter, one that will be handled through different channels. You should expect a visit within the hour." Ockefer almost asked a follow-up question. Then he looked at the gray screen again and decided that some evenings were better navigated with fewer questions. "Can you at least tell me what she does? What her role is?" A long pause. "What she does," Major Whitfield said carefully, "is classified. What I can tell you is that every Navy SEAL currently on active duty knows her name, and most of them would walk through fire if she asked them to." The call ended. Ockefer sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he straightened his jacket, picked up his notepad, and went to take her statement. She gave it clearly, sequentially, and without embellishment. She had asked the group to quiet down. One of them had knocked her drink from her hand. One of them had struck her. She had defended herself. She did not elaborate. She did not perform. She answered every question he asked with the economy of a person who understood that language was a tool, not a decoration. When he was done writing, he looked up. "Is there anything you'd like to add?" "No," she said. "Are you hurt?" She touched her cheek briefly. The red had deepened slightly. "No." He nodded. He clicked his pen closed. He looked at her across the table, this ordinary-looking woman in a cracked sweatshirt who had, according to 3 independent witness statements, put 2 combat-trained men on the floor in under 5 seconds and pinned a third one-handed without breaking a sweat, and he said, "Commander, what actually happened to those men tonight?" Rachel Hargrove looked at him with those very still, very dark eyes. "They made a decision," she said, "and then they lived with the consequences of it." Major Gerald Whitfield arrived at the precinct at 12:41 a.m. He was 53, trim, gray at the temples, with the bearing of a man who spent most of his professional life in rooms where the wrong word could end careers. He spoke with the desk sergeant. He spoke with Officer Reyes. He spoke briefly with Ockefer in the corridor, and then he went to interview room 2. He knocked once before entering, which Ockefer noted, a major knocking before entering a room where he had authority to simply walk in. A small thing, a revealing one. Through the glass, Ockefer watched Major Whitfield sit down across from Rachel Hargrove. He watched their conversation. He couldn't hear it. The audio monitor in interview 2 had a known fault that nobody had fixed, but he could see it. He could see Whitfield lean forward, speaking with evident urgency. He could see Rachel listening with the patient stillness she applied to everything. He could see the moment Whitfield said something that made her expression shift, not alarm, not surprise, something more like recognition, like a piece of information confirming a suspicion she had already formed. She nodded once. Whitfield stood. He said something else. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. She said 3 words. Ockefer counted the syllables, couldn't hear them, and Whitfield gave a short, tight nod that looked like it was carrying more weight than it appeared to. Then Rachel stood, and Major Whitfield held the door open for her as they left interview room 2 together. Later that night, long after the shift had ended and Ackaffer was driving home with the windows down, he would think about what Whitfield had told him in the corridor. He had asked, one more time, one last attempt, who she really was, what she had actually done, what was in that gray file that the database wouldn't show him. Whitfield had thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "You know how sometimes a war gets one detective and nobody's entirely sure why? Why a particular battle turned or why a particular team came back when logic said they shouldn't? There's usually a reason for that. Usually a person. Someone who made the call, took the ground, kept everyone together in the dark." He paused. "She's usually that reason." Ackaffer had nodded slowly, and tonight someone slapped her. Whitfield's expression, for just a moment, became something between disbelief and grimly suppressed amusement. "Yes," he said. "Someone slapped her." He straightened his jacket. "Remarkable, really, the scale of that mistake." Master Chief Petty Officer Darnell Bull Reinhold had a voice that could cut through a helicopter engine at full throttle, and a face that looked like it had been assembled from whatever parts were left over after building a better face. He was 44 years old, had completed 6 Bud S classes as an instructor, 3 combat deployments as a team lead, and accumulated enough operational citations to wallpaper a small room. He was, by every measure available to the Naval Special Warfare Command, the best instructor they had. He was also, on the morning after the incident at Salty's bar, sitting alone in the pre-dawn silence of the instructor's building at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, holding a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from, thinking about a woman he hadn't spoken to in 14 months. The Hell Week class was on the beach. He could hear them from here, the instructor's whistles, the commands, the particular kind of organized suffering that had been separating the ones who had it from the ones who didn't for 60 years. He should have been out there. He would be, in 12 minutes. But for right now he sat in the gray pre-dawn and thought about Commander Rachel Hargrove, because word traveled fast in the community, and the word had traveled to him by 600 this morning via a text from Tours that contained only 6 words. "She was here last night. Cray." That was enough. Reinhold had met Rachel Hargrove 11 years ago when she was a lieutenant commander, and he was a chief petty officer who thought he had already learned everything there was to know about operating under pressure. He had been wrong. He was wrong in the specific, humbling way that only happens when someone shows you a standard you didn't know existed and then meets it in front of you without apparent effort. She had been assigned as the officer overseeing the development of a new close-quarters curriculum, a joint project between Naval Special Warfare Command and JSOC that was looking at whether certain tactical and leadership methodologies could be standardized across units. She was not there to train operators. She was there to observe, assess, and recommend. She had been there for 3 weeks before she did anything that he would never forget. It was a pool evolution. Night. Cold water. One of his trainees, a candidate named Doster, a collegiate swimmer with exceptional physical gifts, and what Reinhold had privately catalogued as a borderline disqualifying ceiling on his composure under real pressure, had been underwater knifed, which is the Bud S term for the intentional disorientation exercise in which an instructor grabs a trainee's air hose underwater and forces them to manage the situation without panicking. Doster had panicked. Not severely, not catastrophically, but enough, the specific degree of enough that was hard to quantify in paperwork but obvious to anyone watching. He had come up gasping, his composure fractured, and Reinhold had been preparing to make a note that would effectively end the young man's SEAL candidacy when Commander Hargrove, standing poolside in civilian clothes, had said quietly, "Hold on." Reinhold had looked at her. She was already crouching beside the pool, speaking to Doster at the edge. Not loudly, not with the theatrical hardness that some instructors used as a substitute for actual assessment. She spoke to him the way you speak to someone when you want them to actually hear you. Reinhold moved close enough to catch it. She said, That wasn't failure, that was information. Your brain told you the worst thing was happening and you believed it. The job is to make your brain wait for your training. Do you understand the difference? Doster, still catching his breath, water streaming down his face, had looked at her. Ma'am. The feeling, she said, is not the fact. The feeling says you're dying. Your training says you're not. One of them is right. The job is choosing which one to listen to every single time. She looked at him steadily. Can you do that? Something in Doster's face reorganized itself. Not confidence, not quite, something earlier than confidence. The beginning of it, the decision to try. Yes, ma'am, he said. Reinhold had put his pen away. Doster graduated Bud S 8 months later. He was currently serving with SEAL Team 7. He had, by all accounts, never panicked again. That was what Rachel Hargrove did. Not with everyone, she wasn't a magician and she wasn't sentimental. There were candidates she watched fail and said nothing, because she had assessed in the particular, uncanny way she assessed things that they were supposed to fail. But for the ones who had it, the ones where something real was in there, buried under fear or doubt or a brain that kept choosing the feeling over the training, she had an eye that missed nothing and a few words that landed like coordinates. In the 11 years since, Reinhold had trained more than 200 operators. He thought of her almost every day because her influence was in the curriculum he taught, in the way he spoke to candidates on the edge, in the framework he used to distinguish panic from capacity and fear from failure. He had never told her this. Men like Reinhold communicated differently. But he knew, and in the way that communities know things, the community knew. They called her Iron Quiet. The call sign had been born in Fallujah in 2012. The details of the operation were still classified, but the outline had moved through the community the way important outlines do, person to person, told quietly in confidence for 10 years until it was simply part of the institutional knowledge of naval special warfare. Her team had been hit by an IED that collapsed their primary exfil route. They had been pinned in a building for 19 hours, communications degraded, with 2 wounded and a third hostile contact moving toward their position. She had commanded the entire duration without raising her voice above a conversational level. Not once. No wasted radio traffic. No visible alarm. She had worked the problem the way you work a long math equation, piece by piece, step by step, the answer never in doubt even when it wasn't yet visible. She had brought everyone home, every single one. In the building, they talked about this afterward. Not in the after-action reports, which were classified, but in the quiet way operators talk about the things that actually mattered. What they kept coming back to was not the tactical decisions. Those were excellent, but excellent tactical decisions were, in that community, not remarkable. What they came back to was the 19 hours of absolute, unbroken calm, of never letting the fear become the atmosphere. Iron Quiet. The name stuck because it was accurate. Reinhold finished his coffee. He looked at his watch. He stood, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the beach and the sound of men in the cold water, becoming something harder and better than they'd been the day before. He thought, as he walked, about what Cray had done in that bar. He thought about the specific quality of mistake that required both physical courage and profound stupidity to commit simultaneously. He shook his head slowly. There was a class of error, he had come to believe, that the universe simply felt compelled to correct. Donovan Cray had walked into Salty's bar and slapped Commander Rachel Hargrove, call sign Iron Quiet, first woman to complete Bud S unassisted, Silver Star recipient, architect of the most important close quarters curriculum in naval special warfare history, across the face. The universe, Reinhold thought, had corrected fairly quickly. He stepped onto the beach, and his voice came out like a depth charge, and Hell Week continued. The thing about Donovan Cray was that he had always survived by being the most dangerous person in the room. It had worked in the Rangers, where physical dominance and operational aggression were useful currencies. It had worked in Iraq, where the private security world rewarded men who projected threat as a primary mode of communication. It had worked for 20 years across a succession of rooms, contracts, and confrontations. The specific, unbroken feedback loop that tells a man not only that he is effective, but that his method is correct. The bar had broken the loop. He sat in the offices of Meridian Strategic Solutions on the 14th floor of a downtown San Diego office building on the Monday morning after the incident, and he was not in a good place mentally. His right wrist was wrapped, a minor sprain from the bar encounter, which he had documented as a training injury. Two of his men had hospital records that would require explaining. And the woman in the cracked sweatshirt, had walked out of the police precinct at 1 in the morning without a charge, without processing, without so much as a formal caution, escorted by a Pentagon major. That detail had rattled Cray more than the physical encounter. He was a man who understood hierarchies. He understood that some people had protection and some people didn't. But the speed and the completeness of it, the way her file had collapsed every system it touched, the way a major had materialized at midnight to escort her out, the way 3 separate San Diego PD officers had suddenly become extremely careful about how they said her name, that spoke of something beyond rank. That spoke of the kind of protection that only existed in 2 circumstances. Either the person was extraordinarily dangerous to national security, or the person was extraordinarily valuable to it. In Rachel Hargrove's case, Cray was beginning to understand it might be both. He had made calls. He had reached into his network, the deep, gray network of former operators, intelligence contractors, and private military professionals that constituted the shadow infrastructure of American security, and he had asked careful questions about a Navy commander named Rachel Hargrove. The call sign iron quiet he had heard once before and dismissed as bar mythology. He was no longer dismissing it. What came back through the network was fragmentary and inconsistent in the way that information about truly classified people always is, because the fragments are real, but the whole picture has been deliberately removed. He heard about Fallujah. He heard about 2 silver stars. He heard the phrase experimental SEAL pipeline, and the further phrase completed without accommodation, and he sat very still for a moment when those 2 phrases connected in his brain. He heard her name said with a specific kind of respect, the tight, controlled, almost unwilling respect that hard men give to other hard people when there is no other honest option, and he heard it said this way by people who did not give that kind of respect easily or often. He had slapped her. The thought arrived with new force. He had slapped iron quiet across the face in a room full of veterans. He was still sitting with this when his phone rang. It was a number he recognized, the number of the man he knew only as his operational handler, the person who connected Meridian Strategic Solutions to the foreign interests that provided approximately 70% of the company's actual revenue, all of it rooted through 3 layers of legitimate-looking contracts and a holding company in Luxembourg. "We have a problem," the handler said. "The bar," Cray began. "The bar is your problem," the handler said. "The problem I'm calling about is that Commander Hargrove has been conducting an independent investigation into our San Diego operations for the past 4 months. A pause. We have recently confirmed that she is significantly closer to identifying our Docklands asset than any official intelligence effort has come." Another pause. "You were supposed to dissuade her." Subtly. Cray was very quiet. How did she know to investigate? "She didn't," the handler said. "She was investigating something else and she found us by accident. The worst kind of accident." His voice was precise and cold. "The slap was not subtle, Donovan. You have made her aware that she is a target. You have also apparently demonstrated to an entire room of military veterans that she is untouchable, which is the opposite of what was needed." "I'll handle it," Cray said. "You will not handle it the way you handled Friday night," the handler said. The call ended. Cray sat in his office for a long time. Then he made a decision that was wrong in the specific, cascading way that wrong decisions made by proud men tend to be, each step logical if you accept the premise. But the premise itself, a catastrophic misread of the situation. He called Walsh, whose arm was in a soft brace. He called Briggs, who had a headache he was describing to everyone as a migraine. He called Pelletier and a fourth man named Garrett, who had not been at the bar but was available and expensive. He gave them Rachel Hargrove's home address, which he had obtained through contractor channels that he would later deeply regret using. He told them to go to her apartment building that night and make it clear, in the most unambiguous physical terms available, that she needed to stop whatever she was investigating and leave San Diego for a while. What he did not know, could not have known, because the intelligence that would have told him was in a classified compartment he had no access to, was that SOCOM had contacted Rachel Hargrove that same afternoon. They had been monitoring Meridian Strategic Solutions for 6 weeks. They had an incomplete picture. They had offered her a formal protective detail and a role in a joint task force operation. She had declined the protective detail. She had accepted the task force role. She had also, by this point, already identified the address Cray's people would be approaching her from, because she had made it her business 11 years ago to understand the way that men like Cray thought, and because she had noticed the contractor surveillance on her building 2 days earlier and simply waited to see what they would do with it. When Walsh, Briggs, Pelletier, and Garrett arrived at her building at 11:20 p.m., they found the lobby empty and the elevator in service. They went to the 3rd floor. They found her apartment door unlocked. The security camera at the building entrance captured them arriving. The same camera captured them leaving 22 minutes later, Walsh moving with a pronounced limp, Briggs wearing what appeared to be a hand towel around his hand, Pelletier carrying Garrett's arm over his shoulder, in the manner of a man assisting someone who couldn't fully walk independently. None of them said anything on the way out. At 11:46 p.m., the same camera captured Rachel Hargrove leaving the building through the front door, wearing a jacket over her sweatshirt and carrying a travel coffee mug. She paused briefly at the bottom of the steps, checked her phone, and walked to her car with the unhurried stride of someone heading to an early meeting. On her phone was a text from Major Whitfield, Task Force briefing at 600, "You're leading the primary." She replied, "Confirmed, I'll be there." She drove away. The building's lobby was quiet. Somewhere above, 4 contractors were deciding, separately and unanimously, that they were done with this particular contract. The task force operations room at Naval Special Warfare Command was a windowless rectangle of flat screens, map tables, and the particular institutional fluorescent lighting that makes everyone in it look like they haven't slept in 2 days whether they have or not. At 600 on Tuesday morning it contained 12 people, 4 naval intelligence analysts, 2 SOCOM planners, a JAG officer, Major Whitfield, 3 operators from SEAL Team 5, and Commander Rachel Hargrove. She stood at the center map table in clean clothes, dark pants, a gray long-sleeved shirt, with a mug of coffee she'd made herself because the operations room coffee was, in her assessment, a crime. She had 4 hours of sleep and looked like someone who had decided that was sufficient. The brief was hers to run. She ran it without a slide deck. "Meridian Strategic Solutions," she said, pointing to the organizational chart pinned to the left screen. "Registered in Delaware, operational headquarters here in San Diego. On paper, corporate security consulting, risk assessment, executive protection. In practice, a 3-layer cutout for arms brokerage on behalf of a Eurasian intermediary network with confirmed ties to at least 2 active conflict zones." She moved to the next screen, which showed a satellite image of the San Diego docklands. "Their physical asset is here. Warehouse Unit 14, Pier 9. It went hot approximately 6 weeks ago." One of the intelligence analysts, a young lieutenant named Park, raised a hand. How did you id the Docklands location? Cray's payment structure, Rachel said. He's been using a rotating LLC to funnel operational expenses. Two of those expenses in the past month were registered to a shell company that leases Unit 14. The lease was filed under a different name, but the attorney who signed it also signed a contract for Meridian in 2021. She looked at Park, public records and patience. Park looked at Major Whitfield. Whitfield looked at his coffee. He had, at this point, stopped being surprised by Rachel Hargrove and had arrived at a more sustainable condition, which was a kind of steady, background astonishment that he kept professionally suppressed. The picture Rachel had built over 4 months, entirely off-book, technically outside her current assignment, driven by an initial anomaly she had noticed in a signals intelligence report that had crossed her desk and that nobody else had flagged, was more complete than anything SOCOM's official 6-week monitoring effort had produced. She had done it the way she did most things, quietly, systematically, and without telling anyone until she was certain. "The weapons shipment," said Lieutenant Commander Asha Patel, one of the SEAL Team 5 operators, a compact woman with sharp eyes and the voice of someone who had learned to speak economically in loud environments. "Do we have a timeline?" 48 hours, Rachel said. "Maybe 72. There's a cargo vessel registered in Panama, flagged in Cyprus, that has been running a holding pattern in international waters 12 miles offshore. It's moved to a transit approach twice in the past week and pulled back both times. I believe they're waiting for a security confirmation from inside Meridian that the San Diego operation is clean." She paused. "After Friday night, they may be accelerating." The room was quiet for a moment. "Because of the bar incident," Major Whitfield said. "Because the bar incident told them I know they exist," Rachel said. "Which means their window to move the shipment is now shorter than they intended." What she did not say in the room, what she kept to herself, the way she kept most things, was that this was why she had not been particularly upset about Cray's behavior at Salty's bar. She had not gone to that bar by accident. She had gone because she knew Cray used it on Friday nights, and she had wanted to see him in an uncontrolled environment. She had wanted to understand the texture of the man, how he operated when there were no professional consequences, what kind of threat he constituted, how his crew responded to him. She had not anticipated the slap, but when it happened, she had processed it as information, the way she processed most things, and the information it gave her was, "This man has lost discipline, his judgment is compromised by ego, and whatever operation he is running is already generating the kind of internal pressure that makes people do stupid things in public." All of that was useful. "I want to do a personal reconnaissance of the Docklands asset before we move," she said. "Alone?" Whitfield asked. "Yes. That's not. I'll have full comms and I'll bring a GPS tracker and a camera unit. If anything goes wrong, you'll have my position." She looked at him steadily. "Major, if I go in with a team, they hear us. If I go in alone, I can map the interior, count the personnel, and identify the handler before we move." She paused. "I have been moving through hostile spaces without being heard since before some of the people in this room were in uniform." Whitfield looked at the ceiling briefly. "Then, how long?" 2 hours in and out. "If you're not back in 2 hours and 15 minutes, we're coming in." "Fine." She went in at 2300 that night. The Docklands were low-light and industrial, vast flat spaces between dark warehouses, the distant sound of water, the occasional beam of a security lamp swinging through the dark on a timer. Rachel moved through it with the particular quality of stillness that her call sign described, not the stillness of hiding, but of belonging, of moving like something that was supposed to be there, the way water belongs in a pipe, without announcement or disruption. She mapped the perimeter in 35 minutes. She identified 6 armed personnel, their rotation patterns, their communication equipment. She found 2 camera blind spots by watching the sweep timing for 8 minutes on each. She entered Warehouse Unit 14 through a roof access point that the external cameras didn't cover, and that the guard's rotation left unwatched for a 70-second window every 19 minutes. She was inside for 40 minutes. She photographed the weapons cache, crates stacked 12 high along the back wall, the kind of ordnance that didn't belong in a civilian storage facility or, frankly, on the same continent as civilians who weren't at war. She photographed the operational documents pinned to a planning board near the east wall. She identified 3 personnel inside the building. And she photographed the man coordinating in the southeast corner, middle-aged, European in appearance, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than Rachel's monthly salary. He was on a phone call. He had his back partly to the camera angle, but she moved slowly, in a 3-minute cross of the warehouse interior that she executed without disturbing a single shadow, and she got his face. She was back in the operations room at 1:05. She put the photographs on the central screen. The intelligence analysts looked at them. Then one of them, Park, the lieutenant, stood up very slowly from his chair. "That's Meridian," he said. "Not the company. The person. The ghost-level handler that international intelligence agencies had been trying to photograph for 11 years. The man behind 17 documented arms transfers, 4 confirmed conflict escalation events, and a file at SOCOM that was flagged at the highest classification level." The room was silent. Rachel set her coffee down and looked at the 12 people around her. "We move at 300, she said. In the hours before an operation, time moves differently. It compresses at the edges and stretches in the middle. The preparation feels both longer and faster than it is, and there is a specific quality to the silence between operators in those hours that civilians never fully experience and that cannot be replicated outside of the situation itself. It is not the silence of calm. It is the silence of people who have made their peace with what is about to happen and are simply waiting for the moment to arrive." Rachel stood at the briefing table at 2:15 in full tactical gear, plate carrier, comms unit, sidearm and primary weapon, the gear worn with the easy familiarity of someone who had put it on so many times it no longer felt like equipment and more like a second skin. She looked at the 12 operators assembled around her. 8 from SEAL Team 5, including Lieutenant Commander Patel and her team lead, Master Sergeant Dario Cruz, 2 NCIS special agents for the evidentiary chain, Major Whitfield standing to the rear as command liaison. She ran the brief at 2:15, 45 minutes to movement. 3 entry teams. Primary, Rachel and Patel with 4 operators through the north loading dock, which would be at the blind spot rotation at precisely 300. Secondary, Cruz with 3 operators at the east personnel door, timed to Rachel's entry signal. Tertiary, 2 operators maintaining perimeter on the water side to cut any marine exfil route. Rules of engagement were clear. Primary objective, detention, not elimination. Evidence collection was priority 2. The weapons cache was to be secured but not moved pending NCIS processing. And Meridian, the man with the silver hair and the European suit, was to be brought in intact. "He'll have an exit," Rachel said. "They always have an exit. The water side is the most likely. There's a small private dock behind the warehouse, and we've had eyes on a rigid inflatable that's been tied there since Sunday. The moment the breach begins, he'll move for it." She looked at the perimeter operators. "Nobody gets to the dock." "Understood," said one of them. "Questions?" "None." "Let's go." They moved through the docklands at 2:52, 8 minutes to H hour, in 3 separate approach routes that converged on Warehouse Unit 14 from different angles. The night was cold and clear, a marine layer sitting low on the water, the smell of salt and diesel, and the particular industrial quiet of a port in the pre-dawn hours. Rachel led the primary team in silence. She moved the same way she had the previous night, as something that belonged, as something the darkness accommodated, and the four operators behind her matched her pace and her silence with the practiced ease of people who had been trained by the best, and in some cases, trained by her. At 300, the rotation blind spot opened. She was already at the north loading dock door. The entry was textbook. The primary team was inside in 9 seconds. Rachel posted at the corner of the first stack of crates, assessed the interior, 6 personnel visible, positions consistent with the reconnaissance, and sent the signal to cruise. The east door came in 4 seconds later. It was 38 seconds of coordinated movement, which is a long time in a close-quarters engagement, and a very short time by any other measurement. The 6 interior personnel were detained before any of them completed the sequence of actions required to become a serious threat. One of them reached for a weapon and was stopped by Patel with the particular efficiency of a person who had made this exact decision in this exact moment, typed many times before. 38 seconds, all 6 down. Then the southeast corner. Empty. Meridian, the silver-haired man with the European suit, was gone. Rachel was already moving before anyone said the word exfil. She moved east through the warehouse, through the rear personnel door, and onto the narrow wooden walkway that ran along the building's waterfront edge. The dock was 20 meters away, and in the cold dark she could see the inflatable still tied and a figure moving toward it at speed. He was fast, she gave him that. She was faster. The chase across the dock was 40 meters of footfall on wet wood in the dark, and Meridian heard her coming. He was, she had assessed, a professional, and he turned to meet her rather than continue running, because he had run the same calculation she had and reached the same conclusion. She was going to catch him. What followed was not the careful, controlled engagement of the warehouse interior. Meridian fought with the specific competence of a man who had survived in dangerous environments for 20 years and who was not. She revised her estimate upward, simply an administrator of violence. He had training. He had reach. He had desperation, which is the most dangerous thing anyone can bring to a fight. He was very good. He was not good enough. Rachel ended it on the dock in 40 seconds, 2 falls, 1 disarming, a final controlling hold that pressed him face down against the wet boards with her knee in his back and his hands bound with a flex cuff from her vest. She was breathing hard. He was breathing harder. The marine layer moved over the water around them, indifferent. She looked up. Crews and 2 operators were coming across the dock at a run. She stood up. She stepped back from Meridian. She straightened her gear. Crews arrived, looked at Meridian on the dock, looked at Rachel. He had served with her for 6 months, 4 years ago, in a different operational context. He knew better than to be surprised. But there was something in his expression anyway, something that passed through quickly, like weather, and was gone. "Building's clear," he said. 12 detainees total, counting him. Cache is intact. NCIS on scene. Coming in now. She nodded. Back in the warehouse, in the white light of the field processing area that the NCIS agents had established, the weapons were being cataloged. Enough to equip 300 combatants. Enough to change the character of whatever conflict they were intended for. Enough that Whitfield, surveying the rows of crates with his hands in his pockets and an expression of carefully restrained gravity, said quietly to no one in particular, "Good God." Meridian was in a restraint chair with 2 operators on either side of him. He was looking at the floor. The European suit was damaged at the knee and the shoulder. He had not said anything since the dock. He looked up once at Rachel as she walked past him to the command station. She didn't look back. In a San Diego detention facility across the city, Donovan Cray was watching the clock. He had been cooperating for 3 days now, giving testimony about Meridian Strategic Solutions operations in exchange for the terms his attorney had negotiated. He was not happy about it. He was not unhappy enough about it to stop. At 3:40 a.m., a federal agent came into the observation room where he was waiting and said, Operation wrapped, 12 in custody, cash seized. Cray was quiet for a moment. And her, he said. Commander Hargrove. The agent checked his tablet. She led the primary breach team and personally detained the primary target. Cray stared at the wall. In the long silence that followed, the specific weight of the last week appeared to settle on him. The bar, the precinct, the apartment building, and now this. The complete and accumulating picture of a mistake that had started with a slap and ended with the closure of an international arms network. I slapped that woman, he said. The agent looked at him. Yeah, the agent said, we know. The commendation ceremony took place on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the third floor of Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters. There were 9 people in the room. There was no press. There was no public record of the event. There was a single American flag on a stand in the corner and a table with a carafe of water that nobody touched. Admiral James Farrow, commander of Naval Special Warfare, was 61 years old and had shaken the hands of more decorated operators than he could readily count. He did not give long speeches. He believed that men and women who did real things deserved to be spoken to directly, without the theater that institutions sometimes wrapped around acknowledgement. He shook Rachel Hargrove's hand. Commander, he said, what you did was well done, all of it. She said, thank you, sir. The file will be updated. Classification level 4, 30-year seal. He looked at her steadily. You understand what that means? Yes, sir. Nobody's going to know. That's fine, sir. He held her hand a moment longer. He was looking at her face, at the faint, fatting mark on her left cheek, the only visible record of how this had started. Next time someone makes this kind of mistake, he said, you might consider not waiting for a second one. Something moved behind her eyes. It might have been amusement. I had information to gather, sir, she said. It was a productive evening. Admiral Farrow looked at her for one more moment. Then he let go of her hand, turned to Major Whitfield and said, make sure she gets a week. Yes, sir. Rachel took the week. She drove north on Highway 1 on a Friday afternoon in a truck she had owned for 9 years, with the windows down and nothing on the radio, and she drove until the coastline opened up and the traffic thinned, and the ocean was close and blue on her left. She stopped at a town she'd visited once before, checked into a small hotel 2 blocks from the beach, and slept for 14 hours. In the morning, she called her daughter. Mara Hargrove was 14 years old, her mother's eyes in her father's face, with a composure that her therapist said was exceptional for her age, and that Rachel privately recognized as inheritance. She lived with her father, David, in Portland, a good man who had tried to be married to a woman with a classified life, and had failed not from lack of love but from lack of information. You could not ask someone to accept absences that couldn't be explained. You could not ask a marriage to run on trust alone, without the content that trust was supposed to connect. They had been divorced for 4 years. They were, by now, something better than they had been as a married couple, honest with each other in the way that only becomes possible once the expectation of permanence is removed. Rachel drove to Portland. It took her 7 hours. Mara opened the door before she could knock. She stood in the doorway in sweatpants and a hoodie, her dark hair in a bun, a textbook under her arm, and she looked at her mother with an expression that was so immediately and completely knowing that Rachel, who had kept her composure in a collapsed building in Fallujah for 19 hours, felt something loosen behind her sternum. "You're okay," Mara said. Not a question, a verification. "I'm okay," Rachel said. Mara stepped back to let her in. "Dad made soup. He said you'd probably come." Rachel stepped into the warmth of the house. "He knew I was coming." He said, Mara considered how to phrase it, he said that when things were over, you'd come. He said you always come when things are over. A pause. He left the soup on the stove. David had gone to his sister's for the weekend. This was his way creating space without being asked, understanding what was needed without requiring it to be named. It was, Rachel thought, one of the best things about him, and one of the things she had not sufficiently appreciated when appreciation would have mattered most. She and Mara ate soup at the kitchen table. They talked about school. Mara was taking an AP history class that she was finding surprisingly absorbing, particularly the unit on the Second World War, particularly the sections on signals intelligence and code breaking. Rachel listened to this with the quiet attention she gave to everything, asking questions that were specific and genuine, and Mara talked, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Portland rain came down in its reliable, gray, completely unpretentious way. After dinner they watched a film. Mara chose it, something animated, something that required nothing of either of them except the willingness to sit together. Rachel lasted 40 minutes before her eyes closed. She did not fight it. The couch was comfortable, and the room was warm, and her daughter was beside her, and there was nothing that needed to be done that she was not already doing. She slept. Mara looked at her for a moment, this still, small woman in worn civilian clothes, her left cheek bearing the last faint trace of a bruise that she had never explained and that Mara had not asked about, because Mara had learned at 14 that there were things her mother carried that were not hers to ask about yet. Not yet. Someday. She found a blanket in the hall closet. She unfolded it carefully, moved around the coffee table without making noise, and laid it over her mother's shoulders. She sat back down in the armchair and returned to her textbook. She looked at her mother once more. "I know who you are, Mom," she said very quietly to the sleeping room. "I know." The film finished. The house was quiet. The rain continued. 3 weeks later, Rachel walked into Salty's bar on a Friday evening. Same time. Same corner seat, left end of the bar, back to the wall, sightlines to every door. Tors looked up when she came in and said nothing, and set a whiskey in front of her before she had fully settled into her seat. On the house. It would always, from this point forward, be on the house. The bar was its usual Friday night self, loud, warm, full of the particular noise of people who had earned the right to relax and were taking it seriously. Near the center, a group of young ensigns were gathered in the way that young ensigns gather, loud and competitive, and full of the specific confidence of people who haven't yet learned exactly how much they don't know. One of them was boasting about his upcoming SEAL assessment. His friends were egging him on. His voice carried across the bar with the clarity of youth and the unawareness of being overheard. Rachel listened to him for a moment. She heard in his voice the same thing she had heard in Doster's voice 11 years ago at the edge of a pool at 300 before the underwater knifing evolution. The thing that was trying to be courage. The thing that was not yet sure it was real. She thought about saying something. She decided against it. He would find out. They always found out. The water would tell him what he needed to know, the way the water always did. She turned back to her drink. Tors appeared at the far end of the bar, catching her eye briefly with the comfortable non-communication of two people who understood each other across the kind of distances most people never cross. She nodded. He nodded. He moved away. The bar noise continued around her, familiar and alive, and Commander Rachel Hargrove, a Colson iron quiet, the woman who had completed Bud S without accommodation, who had brought every member of her team home from Fallujah, who had identified and dismantled an international arms network from a corner bar stool, sat with her drink in the corner and felt, in the particular quiet that existed inside her regardless of the noise around it, completely and precisely at rest. She had nothing to prove. She never had. The whiskey was good. The seat was hers. The night was ordinary, which was exactly what she had come for, and she would stay until she was ready to leave, and when she left nobody would notice, and that was exactly, precisely, perfectly fine.
Io lo posso neanche cancellare il TTS, proprio un imbecille. Non usare quella parola, amore mio cucciolo. Non usarla troppo. Non usarla troppo. È proprio...
Corrupted cores, we're in luck. You find a way to stun him, I'll send you a core, and then you attach it to him. If we do it a few times, he might become corrupt enough for another core transfer.
Così non riesci, vero? Bravo. Ah, sei riuscito tu, bravo Cristino. Non usarlo troppo quella parola, perché dipende da come viene usato. Secondo me, se proprio bisogna cancellare parole, preferisco che lo facciano effettivamente con quella parola. Dipende sempre. Connettimi, ti trasformo? Sì. Come ti connetto? Ah, così.
Even if you think we're still enemies, we're enemies for the common interest. Revenge.
No, voglio ammazzarti. Ci siamo, eh?
Right? Everybody likes revenge. Well, let's go get some.
Non importa, Cristino, non ti preoccupare, tanto al massimo lo cancello dal canale. Non ti preoccupare. Eccoci qua. Succede? Ma ti ammazzi anche tu! È il finale!
So let's call that 3 minutes and then a minute break, but we should leave allegedly 2 minutes to figure out how to shut down whatever is starting all the fires. So anyway, that's the itinerary. Also, I took the liberty of watching the tapes